Thank you, Morris, for having me here at the Press Club today. Can I acknowledge a number of my shadow ministerial colleagues who are here today? Senator Perrin Davey and Anne Ruston, Paul Fletcher is here as well. Strong representation from our economic team here today with Senators Jane Hume, Michaelia Cash and Dean Smith as well. And I'd like to acknowledge a number of the Canberra Liberals here today, and in particular Elizabeth Lee and Jeremy Hanson. Great to have you here today. Just a few weeks before the budget, I spent 8 days travelling around 1,000 kilometres on a bike for this year's Polypedal, riding through New South Wales, through the southwest slopes, and with the canola, the wheat, the wine, the sheep that fuel our exports, I had the opportunity and privilege to meet with and listen to Australians at the front line of our economy. Economics is often conflated with statistics, forecasts and government accounts. But ultimately, economics is about people. And the people I met on that trip are under pressure. Business is good, but they can't find staff. They're getting more hours for work, but their groceries are costing more. They're proud to have saved for their first home, but their mortgage payments keep going up. The main street is booming, but the roads into town need more investment after several wet years. And whether a small business, a manufacturer or a household, power bills are beginning to eat into their pockets and they're worried that it's going to get worse. At the Cowra Neighbourhood and Information Centre, a not-for-profit which provides help for those doing it tough, the CEO, Fran Steed, told me that the demand for their services has never been so high. More than 60 people are coming in every day, many who have jobs and a mortgage but are simply struggling to make ends meet. They're asking for help for everyday staples like milk and bread. People who have never had to ask for help before and have always been too proud to do so, but now they simply have no choice. These people might not get profiled in the weekend papers or be subject to glossy photo shoots, but these are the people that the budget is really about. And the budget was silent on how to help them. Now, the people I've spoken about are real-world examples of the economic dilemma presented by inflation. The economy is, at a macro level, in a very strong position. The Australian economy is fundamentally resilient. Just 2 years ago, we were staring down the prospect of permanent business closures, tens of thousands of deaths and an unemployment rate of 15%. Today, we have more businesses, strong terms of trade, record commodity prices, economic growth over 3% and record low unemployment. Now, not every decision during COVID was perfect, but Australia's economic recovery is a testament to the Coalition's economic management. The Coalition left Labor with a strong economy, a rapidly improving budget position in far better shape than most thought was possible even a short time ago. Our March budget saw a $103 billion turnaround, the largest since Federation. The final budget outcome for our last year in office, our last full year in office, saw $47.9 billion improvement in the underlying cash balance from the budget forecast back in March. The trajectory continued in last year's budget, in the updated forecast for last week's budget, in the updated forecast for 2022-23. But despite this turnaround and despite this economic strength, people aren't feeling it in their everyday lives. The pressure of inflation on household budgets is eating away those national gains. And a budget that fails to treat the inflation problem at its source is a budget that fails to support Australians through symptoms of these cost of living pressures. The best way a government can put downward pressure on inflation is through a clear and comprehensive plan with a sound budget at its core. Now, no government can control all the circumstances and the context it faces. Of course it can't. In government, we had plenty of challenges coming our way. But what the government can and must control, though, is the response to these challenges. The budget handed down by the Treasurer last week was an opportunity to start outlining his plan to deal with the challenges in the economy. The test for the budget was simple: to deliver a comprehensive plan to consolidate the strong economic and budget position inherited from the coalition, to put downward pressure on inflation and interest rates without increasing taxes, to relieve supply-side pressures in the economy by increasing productivity and participation, and to deliver key promises Labor made to the Australian people at the election. The government had the opportunity to deliver a budget that outlined a shorter-term plan to reach or even approach budget balance, containing interest rates and inflation in the process. It had the opportunity to map a longer-term plan to empower aspiration and enterprise, reasserting the role of productivity and lower taxes in driving growth and real wages. We said we would work with Labor if it stayed true to these common sense principles, and we will. We've been upfront on the measures that we support in the budget. As Peter Dutton outlined in his budget in reply speech, we'll support a number of measures such as the extension of the childcare subsidy, the increased flexibility of paid parental leave, measures to reduce the pharmaceutical benefits scheme co-payment, and sensible approaches to ensuring the NDIS is sustainable. From early on in my role as Shadow Treasurer, I've made a point of laying out the principles we will use to evaluate policy, giving the government the opportunity to look for areas of bipartisanship. But overwhelmingly, the budget was a missed opportunity. This is ultimately a high-taxing, high-spending, traditional Labor budget. The Prime Minister and Treasurer are out today saying it could have been worse. Perhaps any budget could be worse. This is hardly a glowing self-evaluation. But my point is that it could have been a lot better. For a start, what we needed in this budget was recognition that economic growth over the medium term has to be stronger than spending growth. Economic growth stronger than spending growth. That's what we did in government between 2013 through to the pandemic. It's achievable, but it's hard and it requires enormous discipline. Instead of a comprehensive plan to consolidate the strong economic and budget position, we have growing deficits and no medium-term fiscal strategy for balanced budgets. Instead of delivering economic growth stronger than spending growth, we have $142 billion of extra taxes and likely more to come. And instead of a productivity agenda, we have union red tape, more big government and cuts to employment, innovation and small business programs. And in terms of broken promises, there are many. $275 reduction in power prices, gone. No changes in franking credits, gone. Real wage increases in this term of government, gone. But the biggest broken promise is the one the Prime Minister made before the election. The promise that no one would be held back, and no one would be left behind. This is a budget that tells Australians the government knows that it's tough but doesn't have the solutions. It's a budget that tells older and younger Australians wanting to work more that this government will hold them back. And it's a budget that tells Australians pain is coming and leaves them on their own to deal with it. Even on Labor's own tests, it fails. Before the budget, the Treasurer spoke a lot about managing debt and deficits, yet his own budget papers show the policies of his government will see increasing deficits, not narrowing ones, and therefore increasing debt. Now, the biggest missed opportunity is that Labor's budget does little to address the root cause of inflation. To help Australians facing rising prices, we need to tackle the source, not just the symptoms of cost of living pressures. The budget fails to use fiscal policy to make any headway to reduce pressures on inflation, to address the source of the pressure. This is something that central bankers around the world, including the Reserve Bank, have been calling for. Instead, the budget raises the white flag when it comes to inflation. A more than 50% increases in power prices over the next 2 years, 56%, rising inflation, rising unemployment, slower economic growth, and as I said earlier, no real wage growth in this term of Parliament. Just after the budget was released, we've seen annual inflation hit 7.3%, the highest level in more than 3 decades. And we've seen the Reserve Bank, the ANZ Bank, the Commonwealth and others now forecast end-of-year inflation to be higher than what was contained in the budget. Now, the important point here is that the budget doesn't make the Reserve Bank's job any easier to contain inflation. Stephen Koukoulas, former economist to Julia Gillard, has said that the budget puts no downward pressure on inflation, leaving, and I quote, the RBA with all of the work carrying the can in getting the inflation rate lower. All of the work in carrying the can. This sentiment has been echoed by a range of economists. Yesterday, we saw the RBA raise interest rates for a 7th consecutive month. This means that a family with a $750,000 mortgage is now paying more than $1,200 extra per month on their repayments compared with May of this year. Concerns expressed by some economists and commentators shouldn't be a surprise. The government's spending an extra $114 billion in the budget compared with March, and on policy decisions alone, it's added more than $23 billion in spending. Across the forward estimates, the government's clocking up deficits to the tune of $181.8 billion. Deficits are now forecast to grow higher over that period, rising from $32 billion in the 21-22 final budget outcome to $51.3 billion in 24-25. Deficits going up over that time period. And spending growth over the forward estimates is forecast to exceed economic growth. The long-term trend and the long-term signal is that fiscal policy is going to continue to expand at a time when the economy is already running hot. But what's most alarming is that the government's own fiscal strategy actually abandons the goal to return the budget to balance. It abandons that goal. In March, the Coalition's fiscal strategy emphasised the need to reduce gross and net debt, cap tax at 23.9% of GDP, and to return the budget to balance. Indeed, every budget since 1996 has emphasised the need to run budget surpluses or get to balance over the medium term. Last week, the Labor government's fiscal strategy abandoned any reference to balancing the budget or capping taxes, completely abandoned. This makes Jim Chalmers the first Treasurer since the Charter of Budget Honesty came into effect to abandon the goal of balancing the budget. Professor Stephen Hamilton from the ANU's Tax and Transfer Policy Unit has said this budget delivers, and I quote, the weakest economic and fiscal strategy of any government since the Charter of Budget Honesty was established, and the exact opposite approach of a responsible economic manager. Hamilton also notes that the government is actively driving the budget deeper into structural deficit. By failing to adopt responsible fiscal policy, the government has abandoned its role in supporting the RBA to reduce inflationary pressures. But we see this refusal to acknowledge the impact that government can have extend beyond fiscal strategy and in a number of the broader choices it made in the budget. Before the budget, the Coalition called on the government to adopt policies that in the medium term grow the economy faster than spending with pro-growth policies that support innovation, enterprise and reduce red tape. Instead, it's decided some of its first targets for cuts are programs that support business innovation, that support work experience, that get young Australians into jobs and help small businesses reduce their power bills. The costs of these programs are modest, but instead we're seeing the money funnelled away from supporting the economy into the public sector and the union movement. Tens of millions to the public service, 20,000 new public servants, 6.1 million in grants to the CFMEU to audit our textile industry, and tens of millions to develop and enforce workplace laws that will mean any business with more than 15 employees will be subject to industry-wide bargaining and strikes. All the while, the pension work policy proposed by the Coalition has been watered down by the government. The Treasurer is happy to use super to pursue a range of social causes, but not to support choice for young Australians and older women trying to buy a home. And regional infrastructure, a vital enabler of productivity and growth, has been rated to fund other priorities that seem to be conspicuously aligned with the electoral prospects of the Victorian Labor Party. By pursuing these priorities, the government has failed this test. The consequence is a budget that offers little to relieve small businesses, to find more staff and relieve supply constraints, and this will make many of those pressures worse in the medium term. But the choices in the budget on infrastructure, on industrial relations and on tax set Australia up for less growth, less productivity, higher costs and fewer jobs. Infrastructure investment drives economic growth. It creates jobs, encourages investment, boosts productivity, busts congestion and supports resilient supply chains. In government, we backed local communities with a range of long-term infrastructure projects that meet the challenges they face. But a Prime Minister who regularly talks up his infrastructure credentials has decided to cut $2.8 billion of infrastructure projects and delay a further $6.5 billion in infrastructure projects in the budget. Now, I've seen firsthand in recent weeks how much these projects mean to regional communities whose roads need investment, and growing populations, particularly post-COVID. We've seen extraordinary resilience in regional areas. Those growing populations need infrastructure support. These projects are game changers that, as I said, bust congestion, build capacity and most importantly, improve quality of life. Infrastructure Minister Catherine King claimed there will be transparency on decision-making in her portfolio, but communities across Australia are scrambling to find out what has happened to their local projects. At the same time, it's put $2.2 billion behind the suburban rail loop, a project that hasn't been recommended by Infrastructure Australia and that the Victorian Auditor General found has a cost-benefit ratio of just 56 cents in the dollar. Meanwhile, New South Wales, the Prime Minister's home state, my home state, our largest state, is receiving less in funding than Victoria, Queensland or the Northern Territory. This is a telling statement about the government's priorities. It's a blatantly political set of decisions, a government which is abandoning our regions to reward its supporters, and we'll see more of this approach when it comes to industrial relations. The government's trying to use the cover of the federal budget to introduce its extreme industrial relations reforms. Now, we all want to see higher real wages. Absolutely we do. But the government is seeking to hide behind this noble aim, and a noble aim it is, to implement one of the biggest re-regulations of the labour market in decades. They're doing this against business wishes, against small business wishes, and despite promises to work with business before the election. These changes will lead to more strikes and job losses, allow unions into small businesses, businesses that have never had to deal with them before, unions before, and businesses that are easily targeted because they don't have HR departments and they lack the resources to negotiate complicated, expensive changes. The changes will undermine competition, so Australians have fewer choices and face higher cost of living and costs of doing business. The productivity hit of these changes comes on top of the costs of repealing the construction watchdog. The ABCC is essential to ensure a fair playing field for a productive construction sector. For more than 445,000 small businesses in the construction sector, the certainty that they can run their businesses without standover tactics or intimidation is gone. Independent modelling earlier this year found that the abolition of the ACCC could lead to more than $47 billion in lost productivity. It's just another example of the Labor Party prioritising payback to their masters over the national interest. Now, there is no greater marker of values in this term of Parliament than what will happen with taxes. Delivering the Stage 3 tax cuts was an ironclad promise at the election from Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese, and they are legislated. Any move to walk away from them would be a broken promise of incredible magnitude. The budget already increases tax revenues by $142 billion compared with March. That's over $12,000 for a typical family. Inflation will drive income tax receipts up by a percentage point of GDP before the Stage 3 tax cuts come into effect. This is the insidious work of that thief in the night, bracket creep. It's a tax on the hard work and savings of the Australian people as more income goes into higher tax brackets. It disincentivises people to work more and to work harder because it's ultimately their incomes that are swallowed up in higher taxes. Labor has abandoned the tax to GDP cap, despite having one when they were last in government, taking the guardrails off taxes and spending. The Stage 3 tax cuts mean the vast majority of Australian workers will keep at least 70 cents of every dollar, every extra dollar they earn. It sends a signal to Australians to get out there, build businesses, build careers, take risks and have a go. If they do, they can use a simple rule of thumb for the reward for effort, between $45,000 and $200,000 in earnings, they will keep at least 70 cents in the dollar. It's very simple and very clear, and we think a huge motivator. It should concern all Australians that the Labor government has lost interest in this pledge and has a placeholder in the budget to water it down or get rid of it. We know from interviews with the Treasurer before the budget that this discussion, that Labor's discussion around stage 3 tax cuts, is being led with the Prime Minister's support. And we've already seen in this budget the Prime Minister and Treasurer break their promise not to make changes to franking credits. Retirees and fund managers would have been surprised to find an unannounced $550 million tax grab on retirees and Australian investors in budget paper number 2, something never promised at the election and never floated with industry. It's clear that the Australian government has decided to pursue their 2019 tax reforms incrementally, but the destination is the same. Higher taxes, sapping aspiration, ruining confidence and dragging down the productive capabilities of the economy. Along with the government's approaches to industrial relations and infrastructure, this is not a medium-term solution for economic growth. Now, the solutions to the economic challenges we're now facing are not unknown. We've faced similar challenges in the past. In the short term, it's crucial to address the supply-side challenges that drive inflation, and it's crucial to embrace prudent fiscal management. In the medium term, it's critical to grow the economy faster than spending to return the budget to balance. So rather than embracing that back-to-basics economic agenda, this budget is full of missed opportunities. It's a budget that confirms that the price of everything is going up except real wages, and it's a missed opportunity to build on the improving budget position left by the coalition. A missed opportunity to put in place a prudent budget strategy that will put downward pressure on inflation, benefiting all Australians. I began this speech by making the point that the economy and budgets are fundamentally about people. Everyday Australians are going about their lives and doing their best to make ends meet. Just before the election, the Prime Minister told Australians that they will be better off under a Labor government. But the unfortunate reality is that by Christmas, the typical Australian family will be at least $2,000 worse off. These Australians will be making tough decisions this Christmas because of a government that doesn't have a plan. Now, every nation is facing challenges born from the pandemic and amplified by global economic headwinds. It's true everywhere. But we approach these challenges here in Australia in a stronger position than almost any other nation in the world. And I noticed the RBA Governor making this point in his speech last night. If the government embraces sensible and pragmatic policies that deal with inflationary pressures and set up Australia for growth, we will back them. We will back them. But if it continues to raise taxes, raise deficits and break promises, we will hold them to account. Australia deserves no less.